Professor Peter Jonason. Peter actually moved from Australia to Europe a few years ago, and he works for two universities, for Padua University and for the University of Cardinal Stefan Wyszyński in Warsaw. He's well known for his studies on dark triad, first of all, and also for his publications in evolutionary psychology. He's also a coordinating editor of Personality and Individual Differences outlet, and also the president of Association of Personality and Evolutionary Psychology. So we are eager to listen your talk today, Peter, and don't keep us in suspense anymore.
Okay.
So please give us your presentation.
I will. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I'm happy to be here. Unfortunately, we have a crap day of weather, but hopefully we'll have some fun in here talking about what I think is very interesting and where I started in my studies. I didn't originally want to do research on the dark triad. I fell into that research in just a conversation one day with a mentor, and it just became something. Originally, I wanted to understand why, why did the women I like not like me? That's basically why I started doing what I did. And it got me into studying things like mate preferences and sex differences in mate preferences and this variety of stuff. But it's a really difficult field in that it's such a popular area that it's very hard to say anything new in this area. And I was advised, for example, by a former mentor to just stay away from the topic altogether because it's such a competitive space. To say something new and therefore get published in good journals is very difficult. So you have to come up with unique things to say, ways of seeing it, angles and all this. And so I hope to present here some new stuff about some new stuff on my part, but novel stuff for the field as a way of thinking about what are the things that people want in their romantic partners? Why do they want those partners? And perhaps a new theoretical way of seeing mate preferences that hasn't really been considered before. Indeed, mate preferences are so popular that we have, book after book after book that comes out about these. So some of these are quite famous, some of these are less famous. So the one here with David Buss, right? I know for a fact it's been translated into Polish. I saw it when the ISID conference was here in Warsaw back in, what was that, maybe 2017, for example. I suspect Jeffrey Miller's book has also been translated. These are two rather, how can I say this nicely, outspoken members of the evolutionary psychology community. Indeed, a lot of people's negativity about evolutionary psychology is because they equate it only with Buss. So they only think about evolutionary psychology in terms of his methods and his questions. And they say, well, there aren't any experiments. And I can point to like 10 people, like, well, what about this person? But you don't think of those people because these are, as we say in English, we'd say the poster children. These are the most outspoken. So, oh yeah, it's David Buss. Right? Evolutionary psychology is David Buss, for example. But of course, mate choice is not just an intellectual exercise, right? We care about it in the popular world as well. Like it's not just some navel-gazing kind of academic exercise where we're looking at reaction time in response to this color or something like that. It has huge ramifications, and people really care about it. So whenever I'm in any social event and people ask me what I study, if I say mate preferences, it's always like, oh, wow, that's so interesting. Like, oh, everyone wants to know more about this. The only group of people who I've ever experienced who don't really care about this are other academics. It's some sort of like, because it's cool and fun, and in this case, sexy, it's somehow less scientific. And I have watched colleagues fall asleep in presentations that I have given before, like in the back, just like this, because somehow it's not interesting to them. But for normal people, for those people on the street, for the people going to, Sen tonight and Level 20, all these bars that we have here, they care about this. This is a fundamental concern for humans, even though professors are sometimes not humans. So what could we say that we already know? We know lots about this because at least since Freud, right, we've been asking the question, what do people want? What do men want? What do women want? So people have been researching this ad nausea in some way. So for instance, I don't know what's up there versus what I'm looking at, so excuse me. For instance, some work I did with colleagues in Katowice, we found that men want to be seen as funny whereas women want to have a man who makes them laugh. So men want a woman who laughs at their jokes, and women want a man who, oh, he's such a funny guy, and not the other way around. And this even predicts relationship satisfaction. If you have this pattern, the relationship is more stable than if you have, for instance, the opposite pattern where she's the funny one and he's receiving the jokes. So a funny guy and a woman who appreciates that humor, this is a good match, a match made in stand-up comedy heaven. Okay, next, for example, I've shown in several studies that earned income, because you can get income from other sources, right? Income can come from the lottery, income can come from inheritance, income can come from stealing it. It's not really income, but it's still money that you've acquired. Women's mate preferences seem to be particularly calibrated on earned income in the men that you want to actually marry. This is why, for example, girls in their 20s who are not particularly interested in getting married have almost this obsession with bad boys. It doesn't matter if they've earned their money. No, it doesn't matter if he's a criminal. He sells drugs. That's not important. I'm not taking this man seriously. But when it's time to make a baby, when it's time to make a couple, I want a man who has reliable access to resources, and he has qualities that he can transfer to my child to also make resources himself. No surprise, physical attractiveness is considered oh wait, there's a typo there. This says physical attractiveness is especially important for me. What I meant to say was especially important for men, but we'll roll with that. So nice typo, my apologies. And when I say first, and this always gets people, it always bothers people when I say this, not just in academic circumstances, but in interpersonal circumstances, because it's assumed when you say first, it means it's the only thing, it's the most important thing. It's a threshold trait. If you don't find the person sufficiently attractive, nothing else matters. It doesn't matter if they're smart. It doesn't matter if they're nice. Ew, I don't want to kiss you is basically the threshold. And so people struggle with this one, but physical attractiveness matters. It doesn't mean that the person has to be, the Lewandowskis or something. They don't have to be beautiful people, right? They just have to be, oh, I find this person attractive. Oh, I could be near them. They don't smell so bad. Things like that. Okay, because smelling bad is a deal breaker. It is. My grandfather told me. Okay, kindness, however you want to call it, interpersonal warmth, kindness, generosity, agreeableness, all of this seems to be a priority for women. My former mentor and grandfather mentor would have both said something along the lines of kindness is a protection quality, right? It's a quality that allows you to say, okay, this is someone who's not going to hurt me. This is someone who will invest in me. This is someone who will invest in my offspring, for example. Another one, some recent work we did in the Czech Republic with some couples. There's even in undesirable traits like depression, there's an assortative pattern, as in people who are depressed seem to pair up with other people who are depressed. The depressed people are staying home together, right? And what's interesting is they're not, about this study, they're not both going down at the same rates. So if I date a woman who is depressed, my depression rates don't change over time. But the other way is not the case. If I'm a man and I'm depressed, and my girlfriend is not depressed, over time she will become depressed. So I am less sensitive to her depression than she is to my depression, essentially. Okay. And lastly, men, in terms of their mating priorities, men will sacrifice kindness, right? So they would rather have a beautiful woman in the short term. So there's a book called Why Men Date Bitches. And it's basically this idea, right? That they'll sacrifice whether she's nice or not for, well, I'm just here for casual sex. So I just want her to be attractive. That's enough. Okay. All right. So, of course, all of this stuff, we have lots of theories to account for it. And it's rare you find someone who disagrees with the facts. It's usually that we disagree around the theories. But of course, some people deny these things in their entirety. There's a relationship researcher, Paul Eastwick, for example. He nearly denies the presence of sex differences in mate preferences at all. He has a very different view of mate preferences. But one of the most commonly used theories in social psychology would be biosocial or sex roles kind of thing. The idea being that we like people who conform to the cultural definition of being a man. And the degree to which you violate or you deviate from that would make you unappealing because you're not fitting into the cultural rules. Another one that is often implicitly considered is structural powerlessness. It's hard to find a reference for structural powerlessness. The only one I have is actually a David Buss study from like 1986. There isn't any citation within that study to say, where does this idea even come from? But ultimately, they argue that the reason, for example, that a woman wants a man who has status, income, all this type of stuff is because women have been traditionally excluded because of structural forces from getting access to those. And that makes women more pragmatic in their mate choice. And because men have access to them, they can be more trivial and therefore like physical attraction. So there's a derogation of physical attractiveness that's implied here, that it's somehow less serious to choose someone who's physically attractive than it is to choose someone who has social status. Now, it shouldn't be too controversial to say it, but we know that physical attractiveness is not skin deep, that it has genetic correlates, that it correlates with health. So someone who has a very asymmetrical face has more health problems than a person who has less asymmetry in their face. So beauty is not skin deep, beauty is actually deep. So it's to say that me liking physical attractiveness is superficial is to miss the point of what physical attractiveness is actually signaling. Okay, another theory. And these are, of course, on the social side, the socio-cultural side of the equation, firstly. And the social learning model. Everyone knows this. I'm sure it's just a matter of applying it to mate preferences, is that you're modeling, right? You model the mate preferences you see. So a young lady would like a guy like her dad because she's modeling the mate preferences of her mother. This is a little bit Freudian, of course. I, of course, don't think that's the case. I think you inherit your mate preferences. So it's a very hard thing to test. And I keep talking to the behavioral geneticists I know, trying to get them to get like some mate preference data when they do twin studies, but they never seem to actually do it, like Nancy Segal, for example. So the implication is that people have daddy issues because of this patterned in this learned pattern that you have as a child. But I don't buy that. I don't buy that. Okay, on the evolutionary psychology side, the most common theory that was drawn upon is parental investment theory. And if you're unfamiliar with this theory as a cognitive psychologist or a developmental psychologist, it boils down to the fact that in mammals, males and females have different sex cells, and those different sex cells have different costs associated with them. So if a woman gets pregnant, and especially in the ancestral past, not today, she is obligated to that offspring for not maybe 9 months, but maybe 20 years. But the male has not consistently had that problem. Now, in modern societies, we shackle men to that reality, but that wasn't always the case. And so that created an asymmetry in men's and women's adaptive problems here. So women were more likely to face the problem of abandonment of their mate and having to deal with this baby on their own. Males were not faced by that problem. Men had other problems to deal with, like what's called paternity uncertainty, the fact that men don't know if it's their baby 100%. And so it has different implications in mate preferences. But this is the most common theory drawn upon in evolutionary psychology for mate preferences. There's other, let's call them more minor ones, similar to social learning. This is called the mate copying. And there's some evidence in not just people, but in fish and in other animals that we seem to mirror the mate choices of the people around us. And so there's something to be said for what's called the wedding ring effect, which is that if a man is already taken, he seems to then be more attractive to women. So they've done studies just with wedding rings, and as simple as that. But men who are taken seem to be more appealing to women for a very interesting reason. And what they suggest is that the woman choosing that man is like a stamp of approval, right? That this guy is worth choosing. It's also possible that these men are of high value. That's why they're chosen. That's why other women want them as well, right? So for us losers who are single, we're clearly just not being chosen. But the chosen ones, to use like every movie, Matrix, the chosen one, or Star Wars for that matter, they keep getting chosen repeatedly, and so there might be even a positive feedback loop. But being chosen leads you to be chosen more, and the other way around. Not being chosen leads you to like this kind of downward spiral. And so maybe it has some implications for this idea of incels, this idea of these people, men in particular, who are involuntarily celibate, who have simply failed to find partners. And in a study we're going to submit soon, it's men who are more likely to be unpaired. They suffer that condition more, and it seems to be in part a function of narcissism and misogyny and the dark triad as well. Okay, last little theory I want to talk about is called sexual strategies theory. This is an addendum to parental investment theory in some ways. It simply adds the context of, well, the way in which we, the way in which our mating psychology manifests depends on the nature of the relationship, how long the relationship is. So in casual sex relationships, the men's and women's mating psychology is expected to be more different because of the differences in challenges that men and women face because of the parental investment issue. But in the long term, both sexes are investing in this relationship, in this offspring. And we do find this, there are fewer sex differences in the long-term context, and there are more sex difference in mating psychology, that is, than in the short term. And indeed, one reason that people like Paul Eastwick and other relationship researchers often fail to find the sex differences that they're looking for is that they fail to take this contextual difference into account. So what they will ask is something vague like dating. They won't be specific about you have a primarily sexual relationship with this person, or you have a committed, a monogamous relationship that lasts over time. And that if you're not clear to your participants about this distinction, people fill in the gaps. And you get something in the middle, because some people, well, I'm just dating. And some people think of dating as dating multiple people. I am dating you, I'm dating you. I'm in the process of dating, as opposed to you and I are a couple, we are dating. And this is, especially in English, this is a vagueness in our use of the word dating. And I think it leads to the lack of sex difference in this group. And unfortunately, relationship researchers are relatively hostile to evolutionary approaches. I remember being at a conference, I don't remember where it was, but a social psychology conference. And I was trying to explain this to someone. I was like, look, I'll come to your conference. I'll come to your personal relationship conference, and I will try to explain to you like these distinctions that we're trying to make, but I never got invited. So yeah. Anyways, so I want to give you a little bit, some specifics about a specific example, I should say. So back in 2016, I think it was, I was on sabbatical in Florida, in a place called Boca Raton, Florida, at Florida Atlantic University. Some of you may know this place. It's a very nice place. I wish I could go there all the time, work there. And a dating service, like an international dating company, sent me an email. They said, we've seen some of your work and we want to see if we can do some work together. And I was like, okay. So I check them out, I Google the site, and they give me access to one of their services, and I log in and I make a profile and I check it out and all that stuff. And I don't go on any dates or anything like that, but I'm trying to figure out if this could work. It turns out it probably can. And so we start talking about data. And I say, okay, well, here's the data I want. I give them a list of the data, and they transfer it to me in Excel files. And if you've ever used Excel in its extreme, you can only get about 1.8 million people on an Excel file, about that, right? So they had 22 countries, and places like America, places like, well, not Poland, but big country, America, Canada, would have over 1 million people. So we would max out those data places. We had New Zealand, which I think was the smallest, and that was like 17,000 people. I mean, these are sample sizes that we wish for in our normal research. So I got a data set of 9.5 million people. Right, of online daters, like not mate preferences, the actual choices that people make, right? The likes that you send, the winks that you send, the emails that you send, and not what you said, just that you did it, right? Just the counts that you did. I'm not doing any qualitative analysis on 100 people, let alone 9.5 million people. Now, I guess you can imagine that there's a lot of crap in a 9.5 million data set, right? We know, for example, this debacle with this sugar daddy website, the Seeking Arrangements, that most of the people on there were not actually who they said they were, right? They were bots. They were men who were masquerading as women. So we had to do a lot of cleaning here. And we were very liberal in our cleaning because we figured, well, we can spare a lot of data. So we whittled it down to about 1.8 million in the end. Now, we still have huge sample sizes in all our countries. So this has huge implications for null hypothesis testing and all that type of stuff. So we tried to avoid any of that, but we saw some really strong patterns, And these are global patterns as well. So, for example, we show the value placed on being having resource acquisition ability. This was a composite of level of education and income. And basically, in every country in the world, women want men who have more resources than women do. Now, you can't see this in this graph, and I'll show you every country in a second. But a man with a PhD received fewer, and I don't mean a little bit, I mean a statistically, a huge difference than a woman who had just a high school degree. So I would receive less interest on these dating sites all over the world than a woman who had only gotten her degree in high school. She had stopped at 18 and never went to school again. So there's this huge discrepancy in just simply women are more getting more attention overtly. So women send less messages to men. They send fewer winks to men, et cetera, et cetera. But what's important about this particular pattern is that it is inconsistent with say sociocultural or feminist models of this variable, which would say that as a woman becomes more educated, she should become less interested. She should have less interest from online dating. This doesn't seem to be the case. In both sexes, you see an increase in amount of interest as people get more resource acquisition ability. Smarter, more wealthy women receive more interest than less intelligent, less wealthy women. Problem is, you can't see it here, but the curves are where it's at. There's a 250% stronger effect in men than there is in women here. So it goes up in women, but it goes up way more in men. For some reason, the modeling software simply doesn't allow us to see this difference, but mathematically we could show it's the case. Okay, now in this same data, we also looked at country effects. And when we published this study, we hadn't noticed this, but I've noticed it since then. There's a weird effect going on that at the high levels of income and resource acquisition ability, there's a little bit of a switch. And of course, given the data set, they're statistically significant. But in places that were affiliated with the UK, there seems to be this switch. So in Canada, in USA in particular, right, this is a good one here, right? There's this switchover that happens at the very top, right? And there's conversion here as well in South Africa, for example. I don't know what this is about. I haven't figured it out. Even in Great Britain, it comes together at the top. I haven't figured out what this is, but it's interesting at least, right? That maybe the observations of that when women get more status, they have less appealing. If they're localized, that they're coming only from American professors, that might be why this is seen as reality, because there might be less interest of American men in women who have more status. They might be preferring more physically attractive to wealthy women or something. But it's intriguing at least. And the data set, unfortunately is, I think we'll get maybe one or two other studies of it. It is surprisingly not very useful as a data set. For the personality psychologists in there, this service collects the big five. They use the NEO. And we thought, okay, we could do like a study on, we actually have data on people's personality and see how that, nope, it's all social desirability. Everybody's presenting themselves everyone is super extroverted, everyone's super emotionally stable. Like it's just not possible. And then nothing differentiates, and so it just all collapses on itself. And so we're left with more of a sociology data set than we are a psychology data set, in that we only have things like sex, level of education, number of offspring, marital status, like, are you divorced? Are you never married? Are you widowed? That type of thing. And so we'll try to, height is another one we have that we're looking at. Of course, we never have weight. Weight's not allowed to be asked. You can only ask height. Weight is a bad question. So we'll do maybe one or two more studies, but I really thought this data set was going to be far more useful than it is, but it's kind of a dead end, unfortunately. Okay, so despite 1.8 million people, what we know about mate preferences is often limited in several ways, and one of those ways is that different researchers come up with different terms. So I like the term ambition, but you like the term social status or drive or whatever it happens to be, and it means that there's this noise in our systems, and we're almost like it's the jingle jangle fallacy problem, right? Are we talking about the same thing using the same words, or using different words, or talking about different things using the same words? And unfortunately, I mean, I'm guilty of this myself, right? And so what happens often is we try to reduce the cacophony of information with things like factor analyses, right? We try to figure out, okay, what's going on in people's mate preferences at a larger level, not focused on this item or that item, but factor analysis, and the way it works is it's contingent on the items you have. So in English, we would say shit in, shit out. If you have shitty items, you're going to get a shitty factor solution. And unfortunately, the control over the items that you put in your study is very low. So you come up with a group of items and you put them in, and you come up with a group of items, and we get different factor solutions. Oh, well, okay. What does that mean? It unfortunately means almost nothing. So hopefully you find similar patterns. And we found some similar patterns in research on deal breakers. So as I mentioned, one of the problems with mate preference research is that it's so saturated. It's so many people doing it. David Buss, Norm Lee, Doug Kenrick, all of their intellectual offspring, me included, of course. So how do you make a mark? How do you stand out a little bit? So one of the things I did I started it when I was getting my PhD, but I didn't finish it till 2015, was to introduce this idea of deal breakers. Now, people know the idea of deal breakers on the street, but to have studied the negative side, like the reasons you would reject a romantic partner, had been relatively ignored in the literature. And we can do factor analysis on these things. So in my original study, I just grouped them. I grouped them thematically. And so we came up with these, let's call them themes of mate rejection, deal breakers, things like unhealthy lifestyle. So for example, smoking, drinking, undesirable personality traits. The person is aggressive. The person is jealous. What else? Limited social status, differing religious beliefs, and differing relationship goals. Like I want to get married and you don't want to get married. And this was our attempt to reduce a list of 40 different deal breakers that we got from a sample. So we qualitatively asked people, what are the reasons that you reject your partners? And then we tried to find a way to reduce them down. Now, we then took this was just recently, so hopefully this should be accepted any day now because it's got to revise and resubmit. But we reanalyzed this data and we suggest that these are the factorial, this is the factorial structure of those 40. Now, a funny story about those 40 is that the list was actually 49 or 39 when we started. And I'm reading the list and there's one missing. This was one of my deal breakers. And I was like, why is tattoos not on this? So I put tattoos on the list. Right? It's a deal breaker for me. And so we collect data in the next study, like how much is this a deal breaker for you? And it's the last one on the list still. So I'm apparently being too difficult by rejecting people who have tattoos. I just don't like tattoos. Like I don't want them on me. I don't want them on my part. Anyways, so clearly I'm a weirdo. So we suggest that things like being gross is things like disease threat. So STDs, for example, right? Being clingy, right? As in overly attached, like you get too emotionally invested too soon. Obviously, promiscuous is an obvious one. Apathetic is maybe my favorite one on the list because this is like the worst. It's like love me or hate me, but just don't ignore me. Like no, I just don't care. I'm not interested. You're no one to me. That's like for my narcissism. I just can't take it. Okay, so Zsofia is an amazing statistician, far better than I am, even though I teach statistics. She's far better than I am. And so she was able to solve this problem for us. And she did it herself before on other items because this is how we connected over this interest on deal breakers. And so she did it in another study with other data, with other items, and found a somewhat similar solution. But things like lacking ambition, being filthy, as we're supposed to use, but even within her, right? This is one person. She used different terms in two different studies. Now, granted, I pushed some of these things. Like I really like the word apathetic, but our solutions themselves are contingent on the words that we chose as labels. This is the issue with factor analysis, right? You have to choose. You have to label the factor, and it's your choice how you label it. And I don't think I've ever gotten a review from a journal where somebody said, that's the wrong label, right? So I called it something and said, no, that's not a good label. I don't think people seem to quibble over that all that much. Okay, now, of course, other people are interested in this stuff too. There's a guy named Menelaus in Cyprus, and he's done something similar. And this has to do with deal breakers during flirtation. So if I'm flirting with you, so I'm going, a friend of mine has a birthday party tomorrow. I think we're going to go to it's not even far from here, the place Sen. So if I'm flirting with some girl at Sen tomorrow night, these are the things that I need to avoid, right? I need to have, nails clipped. I need my, not should have food in my teeth, bad hygiene. Slimy approach is very English, but it's a bit like being creepy. Like, okay, think Italian men. That. Obviously different views. So if I express the fact, this is now more than ever. If I express things like COVID was the most dangerous thing ever, or I voted for Donald Trump, or Duda in this case, right? Like, if that person doesn't feel that way, now it's like it's over, right? I mean, it was very strong with Trump in America. Like, it was like a line that you drew. Who did you vote for? And I've had it here where people have asked me, like, at bars here, and I'm like, don't ask me that. Like, let's not talk about politics. You're not supposed to talk about politics and religion. Nope. Everybody wants to talk about politics and religion. And even with the election in America, I don't want to talk about it. Okay. Anyways, the only other one I want to mention is excessive intimacy. This has to do with violating people's personal boundaries too soon, right? Touching them too soon, trying to kiss them too soon, that kind of stuff. These are deal breakers in flirtation. And why is this interesting? Because there's a whole subculture of people called pickup artists who are obsessed with evolutionary psychology. They love Jeffrey Miller, for example. I'm sure they love David Buss. They love the dark triad. They actually talk about becoming a dark triad man, for example. Yeah. Why don't you, speaking of them, these bastards, they tried to get me to do some research with them, and they're like, oh, let's design a survey. And so, yeah, I'm like, oh, this is a good idea. I want to know about this. And I was younger then, so I was kind of into them. And they just took my work and left me. I was like, bastards. Anyways, so I'd like to propose something else, though. So factor analysis is great, but it's so contingent on the items that you put in, and it lacks any theory. And so it's an inductive process that you could come up with different solutions based on just the same items in different studies. So sampling error alone can drive different factor structures. So I'll give you an example. Many of you are probably familiar with the most famous narcissism scale, which is called the Narcissistic Personality Inventory. Over the last, actually, my entire life, okay, so I'm 44. The first publication with that scale was 1979. I was born in 1978. There's been at least 6 different factor structures published in research, right? We have a 1 factor, a 2 factor, a 3 factor, a 4 factor, a 5 factor, a 7 factor, and a 9 factor. And that's like, well, what's the right one? So now we agree that narcissism is 2 things, right? It's vulnerable narcissism and grandiose narcissism. But I'm in the back, like, eating popcorn thinking, okay, when's this going to change? Like a movie. I'm just waiting for it to change because it keeps changing. This is what we've agreed. And it's these are people that I know, Keith Campbell, they're swearing by this particular solution. But it was all factor analytical anyways, right? They found these structures, even though they found them replicating in 50 countries using, data from David Schmidt, for example. Yes, 2 factors, 2 factors, 2 factors, great. It's still inductively derived. There's no theory behind it. Now, if the traits are correlated with other things, that's empirical justification for the factor structure, but there's no reason to a priori predict. So I want to a priori predict there are really only 4 things that people want in their romantic partners. Only 4 things. These 4 things. That all the things we've been talking about are ultimately just these things. These are the higher order themes, right? And so physical attractiveness encompasses not just how the person looks, but also their health and all that. So it's all of that physicality about the person. Right? Are they healthy? Do they smell good? Do they have a symmetrical face? Are they the right height? All that is in that umbrella. And that people's mate selection mechanisms operate on the super traits, not on particular aspects of these things. Compassion. These are the terms I use. Now, I use 3 C's here because I'm a little bit nostalgic, and I had an ex-girlfriend whose first name started with a C, so I use all C's, and I like alliteration as well. So the 3 C's of mate preferences here. Physical attractiveness is, as I mentioned, all the complexion. Do you have straight teeth? These are all activating and operating on the same psychological systems. The next one is compassion. This is like, are you a nice person, right? I have as Kosha knows, I have a dog, right? Does this person have a dog? Are they nice to their dog, right? Are they nice to other people? Are they nice to waiters at restaurants? All these types of things. Competence. This is something that we as academics are obsessed with, right? Do we show competence? Do we seem like we have status, ambition? We're able to do tasks. We can be a MacGyver, right? We can fix things with duct tape and other things like that. Are we? Do we have good income? Are we professionally successful? And other things. And lastly, and the last one is important because as far as I can tell, there are no evolutionary psychology studies that have considered the idea of compatibility. That if you're a compatible partner today or 5,000 years ago, you're more likely to have a positive relationship, which should influence the reproductive success, not only of you as a couple, but also of your children as well. But we seem to have ignored this for some reason. And I think the switch is that compatibility is a trait about us, about two people, whereas these other ones are traits about individuals. Because you can be a great person, but we could just still not be compatible, you know? So this summer I dated a woman here, and she's a psychologist, like all these positive qualities, but we were just not compatible. Like it's very hard to do that kind of breakup for sure. It's like, look, this isn't working. It's not that you're a bad person, right? We are just not on the same page. You like, loud music, dancey stuff, and I want calm, quiet, this kind of thing. And so we're not compatible. And so I don't know what to call these exactly, but what I've been calling them simply are summary traits. To me, these are higher order themes that are behind people's mate preferences. And we put this forth in a book chapter. And what I'm going to present for you here is some of the work looking at these traits, but then something else as well. One of the problems comes back to theory. And the theory has to do, the problems with the theory is that sociocultural theories seem to be deaf, dumb, and blind to deep time. The idea that mate preferences can be the result, the mate preferences today can be the result of ancestral problems being solved, that it's residual, these are residual effects. That's why regardless of whether or not women can take birth control now, it doesn't make women all of a sudden equally promiscuous to men because you've now gotten rid of the threat of making babies. Women continue to be more cautious about who they date, marry, sleep with, all these kinds of things than men are. In those countries where there's greater support for women, even places like Sweden, women aren't catching up to men in promiscuity. Both sexes just go up, right? So across 20 years, Janet Hyde's meta-analyses on these kinds of questions, the effect size stays the same, about 0.8. And it doesn't seem to be sensitive to these cultural changes going on around us. These group of researchers seem to suggest that everything about you, including mate preferences, is created now. And I don't buy that. I think we come pre-programmed with some things. Just like when you buy a computer, it comes pre-programmed with things so that it can actually exist in the world, like receiving information, interacting with others, building, learning language, for example, as a human trait. Okay. These theories also assume that there's this, whether they say it overtly or not, there's this implicit, people are victims of circumstance. They're victims of economic disparities. They're victims of patriarchy. They're victims of old men with cigars and brandy sifters deciding what kind of things should be on the media. This is a very conspiratorial way of seeing these problems. But it's like a victim mentality. We have no control. It's not about me. I don't want that kind of guy because that's the kind of guy that I think is attractive. I've been told I should like men who are like George Clooney. I suspect that if you were told anything, if you were told something else, you would still like George Clooney, would be my suggestion, right? I suspect Japanese women who have not been told to like, white men still think George Clooney is beautiful, for example. Okay, now don't let me only pick on social psychology. Evolutionary psychology have some problems as well. A lot of these come down to there's often superficial reasons being offered as to why traits matter. It's almost circular in its nature, in the sense that looks simply provide information about genetic quality, and that's something you should want in a partner. Or status is increased by reproductive fitness, but why status? right? Why physical attractiveness? Where, in what way do these play out in people's lives that actually, like what function do they have? As opposed to just the descriptive reality that, yeah, a physically attractive person, and what they say is a physically attractive person has these better genetic qualities, and then what? And then they just let it trail off. It's like ellipses. It's like dot, dot, dot. Okay, but why? Why do people choose that? What is finding a physically attractive partner actually do for you besides finding a good quality genetic partner? I'm not buying it. Okay. And lastly, EP theories, and this is in some ways a holdover from the origin. So a lot of early evolutionary psychology was focused on the universal aspects. So it was a lot of looking how facial affect was the same. So Paul Ekman's work, for example, that no one smiles when they're upset in any country, for example, in any society or anything like that. No one frowns. No one cry. Well, people cry when they're happy. But that's a different kind of crying. People don't get angry faces when they're in love, for example. There's not these seem to be fixed systems that are universal. Now, in the case of some shortfalls, though, this sexual strategies theory, I think it's far less compelling than we've used it. We use it for everything, but it's really just a matter of context. But that context is just this relationship. It's not the context, right? It's not the world. It's not the city. It's not the weather. It's not any of this kind of stuff. People have tried to look at these things like what's called the operational sex ratio. So it's the number of reproducing men and women in the society. But this data is hard to get. It's hard to get the numbers to do these kinds of studies. So people have manipulated these conditions, and it's been successful, but they're not as, but the way in which they situate the findings is very limited, right? And so I want to say something using a theory here that would better allow us to be interactionist, right? Would allow us to put things together better. And this is based on a theory that I use almost exclusively, not that I am the only one using it, but I use it as almost the only theory I use. And it's something that has almost never been used to study mate preferences. And when I was writing this book chapter about these 4 themes, it dawned on me that we've simply ignored this theory altogether. We've focused on sexual strategies theory, which is not a theory of sex differences. It's really a theory of context. It's really a theory of relationship investment moderates sex differences in mating psychology. And to me, that's not really a theory. That's like an observation. Just like sperm and eggs, that's just an observation. So we almost don't have a theory to explain why people want certain traits and they don't want other traits. So that theory, if you hadn't already guessed from reading any of my work, is called life history theory. Life history theory originates in biology, and as all good theories do, but it was originally applied to help us understand how species are different. So how do biologists describe differences between elephants and mice, or poison arrow frogs and chimpanzees? They use life history theory. They describe things like reproductive timing. So when do they have their first offspring? How many offspring do they have at that time? How long do offspring take to develop to the point of reproductive maturity? So at like basically mid-teenage years for us, right? Do these organisms invest heavily in their offspring? So elephants invest heavily in their offspring. They have one baby. It's really, really fat, right? It's like 120 pounds or something ridiculous. I mean, there's some people I know who are as adults aren't 120 pounds, right? Granted, elephants are very big. Right? What else? Other things? Do they? Their social relationships. Are their social relationships long-term in nature? Do they have mutualistic, long-term bonded relationships, or do they, for instance, only come together to mate, like say, some big cats do, like jaguars, the male or leopards, the males and females, they don't spend any time together. They live very solitary lives. Then the mating urge, goes like that, and then they come together, and then they go their separate ways again. Not all organisms do that. Like we as humans, we live in fission, fusion, mixed sex groups. So last night I was in this group of men and women that we went to Halakushiki as a Warsaw professionals kind of event. And now I'm in this group. And then later I'll be in another group, and groups break up, they split together, they move around like that, and they're mixed sex groups. So this pattern is uniquely primate in nature. Only chimpanzees and bonobos are the only other species that seem to, no, one more, dolphins. and dolphins being the larger group of dolphins. So killer whales, dolphins, porpoises, they seem to do that as well. So it's much more cognitively sophisticated animals engage in this kind of behavior. Now, the two main things that they're trying to describe about differences between species is the amount of effort or resources devoted to survival, making a body and keeping that body alive, and making babies. And these are the two kind of evolutionary, the two primary evolutionary tasks that one has to solve: surviving and making babies. If you only survive, you've failed. If you don't survive, you can't make babies. And so you basically need to do both of them. It's just that surviving is necessary for reproductive fitness, but it's not sufficient. You must also go find someone. So I have survived, right? I'm 44. I have survived, but I haven't made any babies, so I have no reproductive fitness. Right? That would be the premise. Okay. Anyways, now this theory has been applied to within species traits, and what we mean personality traits typically. So within species difference would be personality. So we see this in animal literature, we see it in humans, but there is an ability to talk about how we as individuals differ based on this theory as well. So we'd like to make some conjectures here for you. Mate choices are manifestations of life history strategies. Some choices promote R goals, mating goals, like physical attractiveness, and others promote K goals. K is slow history strategies, like compatibility, as in it keeps our relationship together. It's a mutual bonding kind of pattern. Okay, and I'm way behind. I'm really sorry. We would then predict that fast maters should prioritize qualities that ensure offspring survival and also survival upon the dissolution of that relationship. So if I'm just going to come here, have sex, and then leave, I abandon my child. The child needs to have an insurance policy. That insurance policy is that they're physically attractive, which makes them more appealing to other partners and also more likely to survive because they have better genes. Okay, they are sexier. Slow maters should do the other thing. They should be concerned with long-term viability of both the individual and the couple. Right? And maybe then sex differences in mate preferences are really just sex differences as a function of men's tendency to be faster and women's tendency to be slower. Okay. So some particular predictions, and I'll run through them quickly because I know I'm behind. Fast traits should be more valued in the short-term context. I'm arguing that a fast trait is physical. We have time? Okay. Physical attractiveness, I'm arguing, is a particularly fast trait. We all want someone who's physically attractive, but we know that we prioritize that in that short-term context, that context where you're most likely to abandon someone, especially in the case of a guy. Slow traits would be the other traits, like compassion and compatibility. And I say maybe compatibility because we almost know nothing about compatibility in this context. We don't know how it situates with the other mate preferences because these are the first studies that have ever been done. Okay, we know from lots of work on sex differences, men should value physical attractiveness. They should prioritize it more than other traits, especially in the case of short-term relationships. And it speaks to the issue of physical attractiveness as an insurance policy, which enables a fast mating offspring. And lastly, women should value compassion, et cetera, et cetera. So we have predictions about the life history predictions. We also have predictions that are essentially trying to replicate what we know already about mate preferences, but using this new framework that we're advising. So here we are. All we can say is EGMM, right? So we start with Likert data, normative data, just scale of 1 to 5 kind of data. So what I'm going to try to do for you now is run through the method for the 5 studies, and then give you a shotgun shotgun approach of the various effects that we found in these studies that are consistent with what we're talking about. No surprise, things aren't perfect. Things don't work out exactly the way we want, and they're not 100% consistent, which is interesting because the fact that people are really intolerant of those idiosyncrasies in papers. About 10 years ago, JPSP had an editorial that was like, it's unreasonable to expect studies to line up perfectly, for example. And I submitted, and maybe you have submitted as well, a paper to that journal that things weren't lined up, and then I was rejected for that reason. And I was like, but the letter said, oh no, sorry, like, okay, like, so you're just acting like you're just virtue signaling this kind of idea, but when it comes down to it, no, every study must line up perfectly, and you must have. We submitted just recently, a paper with 11 data sets to JPSP, right? So like over 12,000 something people, 11 data sets, and we were desk rejected. Like, how much do you want from us? 11 isn't enough? 15, 20? Because you know they're going to come back at some point if we submit again. Oh, can you do 2 more studies? No, what, 2 more? Give me a break. Yeah, and I know some people, like some of my colleagues, have just given up on the journal altogether. Like, it's just not worth, the payoff isn't high enough. A friend of mine, Greg Webster, did a study, and he showed that your citation rates are not a function of how prestigious the journals you publish in. Your citation rates are primarily a function of you citing other people. So you cite other people, they cite you, and it's this mutual cabal of citations, and we just cite, like that kind of thing. So what do? I have lots of publications. I tell my students, if we're short, if we have too many words in a paper, cut my citations. Like, remove mine, cite other people whenever possible, if we can. And I don't know, it seems to work. Okay, so in the first study, we have 339 Australians, typical distribution, right? So women are much more likely to take these kinds of studies, as you know, than men are, 18 to 70. And we simply asked about each mate preference trait, each of those 4. It says, I value a partner who is blah. And we did this in the short term and the long term context. Now, I'm not sure why my student calculated the Cronbach's alpha for those traits, but she did. Okay, and I just figured I'd present them for you here. So there's some degree of holding together of even just short-term preferences on their own and long-term preferences on their own. But I don't think that's even a meaningful statistic, if I'm honest, because it's like putting together such divergent items, you're not going to get, a good internal consistency here. And then we included several scales that are meant to capture life history speed. And we include several for several reasons. One of those reasons is there's some doubt about whether formal scales like this, like actual life history strategy scales, are useful, because the question is whether you can do a psychometric approach to life history research. So some anthropologists and biologists kind of poo-poo this idea. So we included both life history scales, but also scales that are life history adjacent, like the dark triad, for example. So my case has been for several years that you can understand the dark triad using a life history paradigm. So we included, no surprise, the dark triad as well. And so we have items like manipulating a situation takes planning. This would be Machiavellianism. People see me as a natural leader. This is Donald Trump. I mean, narcissism. People often say I'm out of control. This would be psychopathy. And the last one, I enjoy violent sports. This would be sadism. And if you're keeping up with this literature, people are really trying to add sadism to this equation. I will say that I don't think it should be, and I have some data showing that it's probably only useful when you're measuring sadistic behaviors, and otherwise psychopathy does all the work for you. Anyways, study 2 and 3 adopt a forced choice method. I really like forced choice methods, and I know they're artificial, but I think if you want to understand someone's nature, you have to back them into a corner. Right? What are people going to do when the chips are down, to say it in English? Right? When things are bad, how do you react? That's the test of character when things are bad. When things are good, I can be generous and all this wonderful stuff. But if you're generous when things are crappy, then you have character. Then you are a person who is generous, who is a nice person. You don't just become a jerk because you had a bad day, for example. And so what this is doing is we're trying to develop a new method for assessing mate preferences, but assessing a lot of things in general. We have a morality data on this as well. And so the method is quite simple, but I think it's also quite flexible. So maybe you'll like it and take it on. The first study is just, I got some Italian students of mine to do take the survey, ask your friends, that kind of thing. Right? And we measured one of the life history measures, the mini K in this case. And we only measured the mini K here because this was meant as like a class exercise. We're really trying to be efficient here. So just the mini K in this case. In the third study, we have a much larger sample. We measured the life history strategies with another measure, the high K. And we measured sociosexual orientation. So if you're not familiar with this idea, it has to do with willingness to engage in casual sex, for example. And it used to be considered a one-dimensional phenomena back in 1990s, early 90s. And then they realized, no, maybe there's more to it. Maybe there's short-term, long-term. And this is a scale that I particularly like because it teases apart essentially interest in short-term relationships, interest in long-term relationships, as in like casual sex and serious relationships. And also there's the third factor, which is just relationship, like sexual experiences in general, like the behaviors that you've had. So it's almost like a control factor. And of course, no surprise, the dark triad as well. And we use my measure here, the dirty dozen. And the dirty dozen only has 12 items. That's why it's called the dozen. And so the first item would be Machiavellianism. I tend to manipulate others. I tend to seek prestige or status. That would be narcissism. And then cynical is psychopathy. But the way we measured mate preferences, which is the more interesting thing, is we presented them with two options, right? Choose which matters more to you in the long-term context: physical attractiveness or compassion. And you do it, and you make all of the pairs. And so now you have trade-offs that people are making in the two contexts. But then you can sum up. You can add up the number of times people chose within context and in general how much they chose physical attractiveness. So if I chose physical attractiveness more times overall, that is my necessity. Regardless of context, I want it all the time. I've chosen it. So we have quasi-behavioral data here. People are making choices and we're summing their choices, not just normative scales of how much do you want this kind of thing, which is very common in like the David Buss kind of method. And this allows for a flexibility in analyses. So you can run, it allows for t-tests, it allows for ANOVAs, it allows for chi-squared. It provides a lot of information with a very simple method. And so, like I said, we applied this to morality as well, like the John Haidt, Graham morality stuff. We just make these trade-offs. Which is more important to you, avoiding harm or maximizing equality, for example? All right. The next two studies are budget allocation methods. So if you're unfamiliar with this, the idea is that you give people a fake budget, right? You say you have $10 to spend on making a perfect partner. And how you allocate the money around reveals your preferences, because every dollar you spend on one trait is a dollar you can't spend on another. Right? So in study 4, we had mTurkers. And we used 2 budgets, but there were some problems with this study. And if I'm honest now, since I wrote this talk, I'm pretty sure we're going to drop study 4. But there is still some effects that are worth talking about in study 4. I'm just not convinced of the quality of this data anymore. And partly it's because people really couldn't get the budgets right. It was like people couldn't add. I said you have 10, and they couldn't. They would circle things that like it was 8 or it was 15. Like they couldn't follow the task. And at this time, we had another program called Quest Pro for data collection, and it doesn't allow for you to force the options to sum up, but in Qualtrics you can. And so we had to do some mathematical finagling, and we used this 20% error, so the distributions of the 2 budgets don't overlap. But it's not pretty. It's not looking pretty. So we used the mini K again in this case. We used the short dark triad instead of the short dark tetrad like we used in study 1. And we also used disgust as well. So people who are more likely to experience disgust are slower life history strategists, right? They are averse to dangers in the world. And so there's 3 domains of disgust. For instance, in this case, right, forging someone's signature, this would be moral disgust. A stranger of the opposite sex intentionally rubbing your thigh, and this is sexual disgust. And then we're seeing some mold on old leftovers in your refrigerator. This is pathogen disgust. Right? In study 5, we used prolific and social media to collect data, and we used 3 budgets in this case. But now we use Qualtrics, so we didn't have to worry about people getting the math wrong, because we could just alert them to when they didn't get the math wrong. It's amazing, actually. I think in study 4, we had to lose about 100 people just totally screwing up the math. Like, these are adults who couldn't add to 10, for example. We used the sadism scale, and instead of using the dark triad, now we wanted to look at agency and communion. I know this is very popular here in Poland, and I like it as well. And I would argue that these capture life history dimensions as well. That the fast strategy is agency, and the slow strategy is communion. And so I wonder why we keep getting 2-factor solutions in so many of our studies, like agency and communion. We just keep calling them different things. I think it's just fast and slow life history strategies. So anyways, so the grand result, and I don't mean grand like they're good. I just mean grand like overall. You could decide if you think they're good if you want. But in study 1, there seems to be some evidence that life history speed tracks mating psychology. So in the top left corner, we see that physical attractiveness is positively correlated with mating effort, as in people who are fast, as in pursuing a fast life history strategy, are more interested, they value more a physically attractive partner. We see the same thing with Desiring a physically attractive partner with Machiavellianism, a fast trait, narcissism, a fast trait, sadism, a fast trait. In contrast, parenting effort, which would be the slower aspect of mating psychology, is associated with valuing the very traits that we would have predicted, valuing competence, valuing compassion, valuing compatibility. And valuing compassion is negatively correlated, as you see, with the being fast, mating effort, and being fast in terms of sadism as well. So, as I said, things aren't perfect, but there's something there, right? There's something going on that says that life history strategy does seem to relate to people's mate preferences. Okay, next. We have a lovely interaction. Gotta love those, right? I think my students hate them because they don't know how to make sense of them. But we show that the choice that people made, right? They could choose between a physically attractive or a compatible partner. Women are the same, right? Whether it's women want both of those qualities at the same levels. And that as a function of their life history speed, right? So no matter what their speed is, they want them equally. The effect is in men. Oh, sorry. The effect suggests that slower men prioritized compatibility in their long-term partners. They prioritize compatibility over looks. Compatibility is the trait that would be more consistent with a slow life history strategy, and they chose it in the context that it's more relevant. So I think this is fairly good. There's also a slight effect down here, 0.06, where slower people, right? And I'm not saying slower like, mentally handicapped, right? People who have slower life history strategies chose compassion slightly more than they chose compatibility. As in someone who is nice over someone I get along with. I don't know what the heck that means, but granted, it's only 0.06, and this is this Italian data, so it's only 185 people. So let's not get too excited about it. But given this is new, we wanted to at least take note of effects that were nearing the thresholds. Okay. Now, we find similar patterns here in study 3. Over here, we find this trade-off again in men for physical attractiveness and compatibility. So we replicate it in a sample size that's 2 times as large. Good, replication, right? Over here, we find a new effect that in the short-term context, there's a sex difference in how much people value competence. It's women valuing competence as a function of their life history speed, right? So slower women choose more compatible men. More competent men than men are choosing competent women when they're fast. Okay, moving on. Similar effects. I'm going to burn through this because I know I'm behind time. But we're finding similar patterns correlationally as well. Just to go here at the left, physical attractiveness is again linked with fast traits. Narcissism, in this case, interest in casual sex. Okay. Again, similar effects we find over here, right? Being slow is associated with wanting compassion. Wanting attractiveness is associated with Machiavellianism, and the opposite, not being high on moral disgust. Compatibility here, being low on a fast trait, narcissism. Being low on a fast trait. No, that one is inconsistent. I don't know what that means. Yeah, okay. Oh, Machiavellianism. Sorry, this one, right? So that if you're Machiavellian, you don't particularly care about compassion. Compassion is not a quality that's associated with being slow, with being fast, as a Machiavellian would be. We find similar evidence as well for in our budget as well, budget 5, study 5. Some mate preferences research. We find that so as you go up, it's men favoring the traits. As you go down, it's women favoring the traits, and the 2 bars are context. So it suggests over here that men in the short-term context versus the long-term context prefer physical attractiveness. So here we're just replicating effects from prior literature. Compassion being the strongest effect for women. Women really in the short term really want someone who is safe, essentially, right? So if you're just having casual sex, there is a danger, there's a greater danger imposed upon you, and having a nice guy is particularly important in this context. Compatibility, people don't really care about compatibility. That's one of the features of all the studies that you'll see, including the next slide, that compatibility seems to be the lowest. Now, why might this be the case? Well, because we have weird samples. And so, not compatibility, sorry. Competence is the lowest one. Competence. Well, because everyone's kind of got their own thing. Everyone has their own money. Everyone has their own home. There's not a high degree of pressure being exerted that you really need a competent partner, a partner who has status, money, resources. But nevertheless, we find more replications of these kinds of effects, and that the preferences map onto context. So maybe I'm onto something about these 4 dimensions. We look at the trade-offs as well. We find similar patterns with the trade-offs. So in the case of the attractiveness compassion trade-offs, we find patterns like this. So in the long term, it's all about compassion. But in the short term, it's mostly about physical attractiveness. We find something else similar when it comes to the attractiveness competence trade-off. It looks almost identical, right? That competence and compassion are traits that are being valued in the long-term context in particular. And last one I want to show you, make sure it comes up, right? Physical attractiveness is, again, when it comes to trading off compatibility in physical attractiveness. So all the slow traits seem to be operating where you'd expect them to be, valued in the long-term context. All the one fast trait, I wish there was more than one fast trait, but physical attractiveness is always in the short-term context. Now, not as much here. Now, remember, compatibility hasn't really been studied before, so I'm not sure what to make of this trade-off, but I suspect that there's some utility for being compatible even in casual sex relationships, right? That you need to be on the same page, you need to have the same sexual style, rhythm, whatever you want to say. Okay, so these 2 figures are quite hard to make sense of, but ultimately they show that at the top, women are prioritizing things like competence, but they're prioritizing it in the beginning at low budgets, and then that fades over time. On the bottom, you find that men, which is the bottom side, right? This is the men valuing it. They place most of their budget in the beginning, right? Low budget. I must have this trait, right? And then it wanes off because they start wanting other things in their partners over time. And when you switch over here to the short-term context, you see a different pattern, right? So men continue to want and place a high amount of investment in the attractiveness of their short-term partners. And this compatibility seems to be in the middle, seems to be particularly unimportant. So compatibility is not particularly valued, but competence in both cases seems to be flatlined, right? So competence is here, right? It's always in women, right? Or this one is almost, it's just barely in women, but it doesn't seem to change as a function of budget amounts. Okay, so if people's life history strategies are geared towards solving the adaptive challenges of mating and survival, it would only be logical that their mate preferences should track onto that. So I don't think this is something that's out of the blue. I think this is a logically derived series of predictions that just simply haven't been like tied up in a bow yet. Okay? But most research focuses on, for instance, social forces behind mate preferences, like resource scarcity, for example, or relies on this parental investment-based model. I think parental investment-based models can be easily integrated within life history strategies. So ultimately, we would say something like fast maters tend to be men, prioritize looks and deprioritize compassion, and have traits that we associate with being fast, being agentic, being narcissistic, and having limited disgust. Slow maters, and indeed, I call this paper fast mating, tend to be women, prioritize compassion and deprioritize looks, are communal, have active disgust systems, and are slow life history strategists. So I hope this will lead to some sort of consilience between these 2 conflicting paradigms of mate preferences, that they can work in tandem in a coherent way, and that we will start seeing parental investment theory as just a biological reality, like it is like gravity, right? It's just, okay, this is the case. What it means is more interesting, but okay, I accept that men and women have different sex cells. Okay, now let's go forward. Okay. Social theories will then propose local and developmental calibration, but they often miss the mark about why these things matter and what matters. But maybe this gives them a reason to say this is why physical attractiveness matters, because it has to do with calibration of life history speeds. Okay? So to take it together, life history theory then might draw it all together and say that mate preferences are part of a larger coordinated system to solve adaptive problems constrained by biological realities like eggs and sperm, but flexible enough to accommodate local socio-ecological conditions. Like different countries will have slight variants of these patterns because of different conditions. Okay. Now, obviously, several limitations. Everything here is really, it's weird, right? All of my data is weird. Nothing I can do to get around it. I don't have any particular reason to predict that non-weird countries will have different manifestations of mate preferences, that physical attractiveness will all of a sudden become irrelevant to men in Uganda or something. I have no reason to believe that. And indeed, if we're null hypothesis testers, that's exactly the position we should take, is that you should expect it to be the same until you have a really good reason to not expect it. But we don't do that. We don't play that game. We act like, oh, there's going to be a difference. So I'm not buying it. Study 2, as you know, with the Italian sample, the problem wasn't that they were Italians. The problem was it's only 185 people. But we adjusted this in other studies. We have better samples than the rest. Our traits that we measured are broadband. We didn't look at any facets, right? We didn't like boil narcissism down into like the vulnerability and agency and all these other aspects. The results don't all hit the mark, right? We don't have a lineup that every time all of the dark triad are lined up in the same way. There's error there, of course. One obviously problem is that we're not manipulating anything. This is personality psychology in the sense that it's all self-report data, right? It's a variety of methods that we're using, but I'm not running an experiment. I'm not making people feel like their life is under threat or they're not going to have enough money next week or anything like that, which should then calibrate their mate preferences. So for example, I'm putting together a little grant in Italy now where we will compare regions of crime. So, you know, Italy has a history of crime, but not every region does. So Calabria, this is like the cocaine hub of Europe, right? And I only know this because I was told this. I don't know for any other reasons, I promise. But we're going to compare Calabria to, say, like Veneto, right? And maybe Lombardy. And what we would expect is that mate preferences should be calibrated, should change in these different features because of the ecology of being difficult. I made up these 4 dimensions, right? There's no validation of these 4 dimensions. This is my sense as someone who's been looking at this literature for 20 years. I was asked to write a chapter, and I wasn't really willing to just write a chapter. I wanted to say something bigger. So I was like, okay, what else, what bigger things can I say? And this was our offering. So there's no psychometric validation of it yet. We, of course, human focused. I love doing animal research. You know, this is the spider monkey here. But these mate preferences should play out in chimps and in dolphins. Like, I don't know how to figure it out, but there has to be a way that because life history theory is a biological theory, it's not a human theory, so it should apply. Lastly, as I already alluded to, there is some doubts about whether you can do this psychometric approach to life history strategy in general. And so they would ask that we do experiments or that we actually collect data in the field, for example. And I'm just not equipped to do anything like that. So I think you know what I've shown, so I won't belabor this. But just in the case of give you a sense of a summary, we seem to have quite a bit of evidence to back up the life history utility of mate preferences. And we have similar evidence consistent with prior literature to back up the idea that these 4 mating dimensions capture what we mean by mate preferences. All right? So that's it. Sorry it took so long. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your excellent talk. So now we have a question and answer round. We have around 15 minutes. We are recording today's meeting because Peter asked to record the meeting, so we're doing this. We should use the microphone, so everybody who wants to ask a question, please use a microphone. It would be great if you introduce yourself to online audience as well. So who would like to start? Okay, Maciek.
Thank you very much. My name is Maciek Skorko. I'm an employee here at the Institute of Psychology. Louder? Okay, I'll speak louder. So,
yeah, I'm sure the people online can hear you, but I have to hear you too.
So I just wouldn't want to overblow my voice strength through the microphone. So anyways, sir, I'm wondering, what is your approach to your theory about long-term and short-term strategies in terms of modern technologies,
Okay.
and like pushing people towards, I think, more of those short-term strategies rather than long-term relationships, I think. How do you see the advances in the modern technologies have an impact on what you're studying? Thank you very much.
So I think the issue is things like dating apps like Tinder and all that, because they're so image focused, they almost push us in the direction of long-term. But we still have desires of our own to make babies, to form long-term meaningful couples. It's still in our psychology. It's just the ways in which we're contacting one another, the medium through which we're going through has an influence, certainly. But people get married off of Tinder. for example. They meet, and you can do anything you want. It's really a dating service, even though we give this negative reputation to Tinder as a short-term hookup. While people might use it for that, people do also use it for finding relationships, and people who start casual become something else. So I'm not sure if it's fundamentally changing it, but we've definitely become less committed to relationships because there's an apparent steady supply of apparently interested and willing people, right? So I get the sense that this person is on my phone, right? It feels very intimate. I'm on my couch at home. Oh yeah, and it seems like I have this option, right? And this is it's a change in dating. The real change here is that we've moved from being satisficers to being maximizers. So our parents and our grandparents' generations were satisficers in mating. But they found someone who was good enough, they got married, they moved on with their life. My grandparents were married for something like 68 years. Right? This is a monumental amount of time in anyone's mind, I think. And it was this kind of situation. They found someone that was good enough, and right? But my generation, maybe yours as well, we're almost always looking to trade up, to find someone better looking, someone more successful, someone whatever, even trivial stuff like we both like Star Trek or something like that. So I think that's the real shift, is the satisficing to maximizing distinction. And that's what gets us into the short-term game, because the apps encourage maximizing thinking. No, you can't follow up. No.
Just
Only one question.
Yeah, sorry, just one follow-up, because I was thinking that it's more on the basis of how you view the costs you have to like put into building a relationship, in the sense that if you're in a stable relationship, it is a way to think about it that to change it requires some effort, right?
It's very easy to change relationships now.
And that's,
for sure.
that's the perspective I have on my mind, that it kind of like what is possible right now. It's just the connections we built through the internet.
It's very easy to meet people.
It makes the cost much lower, and I think it has to have some kind of a global, I mean, in developed countries, definitely impact on how people are easier to disengage with a relationship, because it is easier. It requires less effort to get into another one. That was my perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I can't even. There's nothing I can say. That's absolutely correct, right? Our level of commitment is a function of the quality and availability of alternatives, and we have the perception that there is more availability, right? And even if it's not really available, it just looks available. It's a lot more work to go out and meet someone in person, but swiping, it's just like swipe, and it just seems like, why stay with this person when they're not 2 meters tall, they're 179 or something like that, like something so trivial as that. This might be why there's a decrease in sexual activity, for example, in the kind of young generation, is if they're not staying long enough in any particular relationship, there's always that lead up time before you have sex. And so you're constantly in this state of reinitiating the relationship to get to sex. And so that might be, less time in bed and more time talking to strangers.
Thank you. Do you have any other questions?
Thank you for your very interesting talk. I'm afraid I couldn't understand well everything you said, but I love your way of talking.
I'm sure I talked too fast. Sorry. Was that a question?
No. No. Yes. Next.
First, a compliment.
Sentence, yes,
This
compliment.
is. I know it's coming. I'm ready for the. I'm ready for it.
Okay.
Compliment first, and then kill me. I gotcha. Okay.
You said that your studies are based on weird samples. Right?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Do you expect any differences in your theory or in your results when you go to find anything interesting in non-weird societies?
I would expect quantitative differences, not qualitative differences. Yes, absolutely. So different, say, cultures will have different local conditions, which should recalibrate your preferences. For certainly that's the case. What the question is not whether there are differences. The question is really what are the mechanisms, what are the mediating variables? What are the mechanisms that are responsible for those differences? So doing a cross-cultural study on its own, I think, is a really superficial kind of approach. It's account for the differences between, say, Polish people and Japanese people, for example. So it's, if there is a difference, which we shouldn't assume there is automatically, but if we detect a difference in a study, well, why would we expect the difference in the first place? Include that mediator in your analyses, in your data collection. That would be ideal. But cross-cultural psychology is often very haphazard in its, I'm just collecting data from different countries, but I'm going to pick two countries. I'm going to pick them for a reason, for example, right? And maybe it has to do with the amount of pathogens in that country. Like we're doing in Italy. We know that Calabria has lots of crime, and we know that Veneto doesn't. And so we're picking those regions intentionally to say, this is the difference that we're making. It's not perfect because they actually speak different languages, which is something that Italians are, you may not know. There is an Italian language, but Italy is like a weird conglomeration of states already. Like people in Napoli don't really speak the same Italian as people in Veneto. And so even that is going to be hard because you have linguistic differences to overcome. But yes, I absolutely expect there's differences. The question is why they exist is far more interesting to me. More. Question 3.
I have another one, but this time on the methodological side of things.
Okay.
I was really curious about your perspective on what you mentioned at the beginning of your talk about getting the sample from this massive 9.5 million population of subjects coming from those dating sites. And especially I'm interested in your opinion about gathering the personality, temperamental data from the questionnaires. Do you believe there is a way to gather, let's say, reliable data from those sources, or you would be rather on the side of thinking that it's rather impossible because of the setting, because of people want to just present themselves in this better view? Is there a hope for us to actually have the ability to gather this kind of a data in large quantities and at the same time have a reliability? And what to do if you have those maybe experiences? I think they are very unique, taking the amount of data you work with. What could be done to get a higher quality of data coming from this source? Thank you very much.
I think one of the problems with it is because they use the NEO, you have this super long measure, and I think people can figure out what's going on. So people aren't idiots, and so it's like, okay, they keep asking me questions that are like, okay, I'm gonna say positive things. So that's problem 1. Problem 2, I think the questions themselves of the Big Five in particular lend themselves to a particular kind of responding. And so we need to ask in more subtle ways. We need new measures that are less obvious about what they're asking. So if I ask you, are you the life of a party, might be more subtle than saying, are you extroverted, for example. And so if we can be more subtle and ask fewer questions, that might be. If we could work out behavioral analogs, and we could ask people choose, what on Friday night, what do you want to do, for example? And we would reason that if I've chose on Friday night to go to a bar or a party, that I'm extroverted. It doesn't look like a personality questionnaire, and so it probably doesn't make people's antennae go, hey, wait a minute. Just like, oh, they want to know what I value. So people who value parties are likely to be extroverts. People who value, order in their life, do you clean your house every day? This is a conscientious person. So maybe that's what we need to do and make it a little bit more like OkCupid does. So the dating site OkCupid is a little bit less psychometrically robust, but they ask these kinds of questions, and they present us with some really cool data analytics sometimes. Like one I remember that was, if a woman says she likes the taste of beer, she's more likely to have sex with you, for example. Yeah, it's just straight up data analysis, right? It's data mining of all their participants, whatever it means. That's what they found. Yes, well, I'm only 44. I still have some hope left in me. Maybe in my shoe here, I think. But
thank you very much. I think that we have time for one quick question, if there is any. Okay. Yes.
So my question is very easy. So I do like this compatibility factor. If I understood your presentation well, it means that it explains to some extent, of course, the long-term relationships. But it happens that not compatible people sometimes are engaged in the relationship, satisfying both parts.
Mhm.
So how does evolutionary psychology explain those phenomena?
Well, I guess the issue would be, how are they incompatible? If they're incompatible in trivial ways, right? So if my partner doesn't like Star Trek and I like Star Trek, it's not really a deal breaker. But if I am an atheist and she is, a diehard Christian, yeah, that may be a more fundamental difference. So the question of compatibility, which we're trying to look at, we have a publication under review now, is that what are the features that people think make people compatible? We found something like 24 different things, and it has to do with things like religion, how you like to spend your free time, even like vacations that you might want to take. And I would suggest that it's about how important those things are determining incompatibility. So if you're compatible on core things, you're probably good. And it would be nice to be compatible on the trivial things. So it's like a necessities and luxuries situation, right? I must be compatible. Like, for instance, you must be a woman. We must be compatible, right? As a heterosexual man, that's a compatibility. You must be intelligent. You must look this way. You must like clothes, right? I can't date a woman who doesn't like clothes. If you come in looking all like, bohemian, right? I can't do that. I'm bougie. And so this is an incompatibility. And I value clothes enough that would be a deal breaker. But if I thought clothes were unimportant, wear whatever you want. It's unimportant, but it's a value for me. And so this is why compatibility is hard to study, because everyone has their own values and they calibrate based on the nomothetic approach is very difficult here because it's a couple, right? It's how you two fit, not that you have good qualities and you have good qualities. So I think you can be apparently divergent people, but still have something in your core that makes you compatible. I think that's what holds you together.
Okay, thank you very much. It was the last question, or Grzegorz? No. Okay, so it was the last question. Thank you very much. It was
Thank
so
you.
pleasure to have you in person in our seminar. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Właściwie jeszcze 10 minut. Ja